history nerds and historians. My name is Christina, and this is Effed Up History. This is where we talk about a little tidbit from history that's super fucked up. Today, we'll be talking about the wonderful, amazing, beautiful, fierce, powerful icon that nobody knows about. This woman has been called the Harriet Tubman of California, the Marie Laveau of San Francisco, Rosa Parks, 100 years before Rosa Parks, the mother of human rights in California, and was the first Black female millionaire in America. Now, with that description of this amazing woman, you probably know who I'm talking about, right? Probably not, because she's been shit all over by American history, and that is fucked up. So today we are talking about one of my personal heroes, Mary Ellen Pleasant. I actually first heard about her from an episode of Drunk History, and I thought that she was really amazing, and the way that society treated her was really messed up. So I looked into her a little bit more to research her for this episode of Effed Up History, and holy fuck, Drunk History has left so much out. I mean, it is like Hollywood making a movie out of a book that they never read. Those segments are only 10 minutes long, so I can't really blame Drunk History for just taking, arguably part of the most interesting part of her story, but it's not even the most interesting part of her story. There is so much more that is more interesting than what they talked about in that episode. So, if you watch Drunk History, which you might, considering that you're listening to a podcast about messed up history, just know that if you've seen the episode of Mary Ellen Pleasant, you don't even know the half of it. So sit back, friends. Sit back, relax, and practice your, oh good God, what the fuck faces. Now, Mary's origins are a little shrouded in mystery. You'll come to find out that she was a little bit of a storyteller. It's kind of one of the reasons why I think history doesn't talk about her as much, because no one knows the full truth, and historians tend to want the full truth concretely. There are 3 memoirs that I can find reference to. I couldn't find the actual memoirs, but I found reference to them, and she often changed her story based on what people were saying about her. She's quoted in one of her memoirs to have said, quote, "Some say that words are made to reveal feelings, but I say that words are made to conceal them." So she essentially made herself a real life mythological character, which didn't always work in her favor. So she was born on August 19th of either 1814 or 1817. And that's not necessarily her giving different birth years. That's monuments that have been erected for her, or her gravestone saying different things. So her gravestone says 1817, but other sources like the plaque that's up in San Francisco that honors her at her park says 1814. She was either born in Georgia or Pennsylvania. Her parentage is also disputed. In some cases, she said that her mother was Black and her father was Hawaiian, which later on we'll talk about the images surrounding her that are if you Google image search her, which would be very interesting if her father was Hawaiian, considering one of the people that she's often mistaken for was a Hawaiian princess. In other sources, she says that she was born a slave to a voodoo priestess and a white plantation owner / journalist named John Pleasance. Either way, when she was born, she was known as just Mary. She also mentioned to her goddaughter that she witnessed her mother being beaten to death by a plantation overseer. And after that, she went to go live with Louis Alexander Williams, who was a silk merchant who freed her from slavery and educated her. So this is along the voodoo priestess and white plantation owner story of her parentage, which seems to be the more convincing one, seems to be the one that's more aligned to truth considering the rest of her story. But again, we don't know for sure. Louis did have her educated, but apparently he wasn't as great as you would think, even though he showed compassion to a young woman of color in a time when most wouldn't. He was actually really worried about what people would think about him educating a former slave, and he pulled her out of school relatively quickly. He also didn't treat his wife, Ellen, very well at all. And Mary was very outspoken and very strong-headed from the beginning, and she spoke up against him all the time. And that's actually where she gets part of her name from. She adopted the name Ellen Williams to honor her and became Mary Ellen Williams. So Mary's attitude about everything mixed with the apparent debts that Louis had led to him selling her back into servitude, which is just great. It's just so nice of him. I love that for her. It's just... So she was indentured. Instead of going straight back into slavery, she became an indentured servant. So basically, like, the difference is that, if you don't know, is that, like, an indentured servant has a contract and they only have a specific amount of years to serve and then they're freed. Whereas a slave is, they're in bondage for life unless, out of the goodness of somebody's heart, they're freed. Like, typically it's just free labor forever, whereas an indentured servant is free labor for a small amount of time. So the family that she was indentured to lived in Nantucket, Massachusetts. Although she was a servant, she wrote about how they actually treated her really well. She said it was like she was part of the family, so much so that when her contract ended, she stayed with them. She called the matriarch grandma. The family that she was with were Quakers, who were religious extremists that came to the colonies in the 17th century to escape religious persecution. And although they sound a lot like the Puritans, they were actually very religiously tolerant and welcoming to other people. They believed that everyone was equal in the eyes of God. They were actually some of the first feminists and abolitionists in the world. There's one document I found from France before the Revolutionary War that were Quakers speaking on behalf of freed Black people in the West Indies who were being mistreated and discriminated against. I honestly love the Quakers. The family that she was living with was even part of the Underground Railroad. So the only thing that I question is if the Quakers were so open to her and the family that she was with, they were so welcoming to her and treated her like one of the family. It's like, why did they purchase her? And the only thing that I can think of is that they were trying to stop her from going back into bondage or trying to make sure that she was in a good home. I think that's me, like, just trying to paint all Quakers with the same light and say that they were all good people. I know that that's not always the case. So I don't know why this Quaker family, who was part of the Underground Railroad, who, treated her like part of the family, purchased her in the first place. Like, but yeah. And then, like, they worked her. She was a servant. They had her work in the front end of the shop that they owned, where people would, like, always comment about how fair her skin was, which back then was a compliment. But every time someone made a comment about that, she would shift it to show that she was more than her pretty looks and her fair complexion. And she was more focused on her intelligence and wit, which is just amazing. And part of me wonders if that has something to do with if she was born on a plantation, which seems to be, like, more of her convincing origin story. If you were a slave on a plantation with fair complexion and beautiful looks, life was not good for you if you were a woman. Like, Sally Hemings, for example, was allegedly, like, a really beautiful, fair-skinned slave. And she was like a sex slave to Thomas Jefferson. That was not something that was uncommon. Like, slavery was terrible. Slavery was free labor. Slavery was, a bondage for life, but it was also human trafficking and also sex trafficking. Like, people would pay more money for young, fair-skinned slaves who were most likely predominantly white in their lineage, who were the product of generations of rape by plantation owners, and they would be sold for more money to be used as sex toys. And then when they were used up, they would often be sent to a different plantation and sometimes separated from their children. And, it was just, like, institution of slavery was just bananas. And it's just, like, disgusting when you learn even more about it. Like, it's disgusting when you learn about people being taken from Africa in 1619 and brought over here into the American colonies and worked on the plantation because people didn't want to pay indentured servants anymore. They just wanted to pay a one-time fee and be done with it. And it's disgusting learning about that. And it's even more disgusting when you learn that, like, all of the sex trafficking that went into it. So part of me wonders if the reason why she was always like, yeah, okay, I have light skin and I'm pretty, but like also I have all these other things going for me as well, don't objectify me, was because like if she was on a plantation, who knows what her fate would have been, you know? As Mary got older, she still valued her wit and intelligence, but she started not to ignore the fact that she was attractive. She was no longer an indentured servant at this point, and she sort of just used that to her advantage to like get jobs and work into society. She was in her 20s when the family that she was indentured by and then stayed with after her servitude was over, they helped her find a job in Boston. She became a tailor's assistant and started designing all of her own clothing and was like the height of fashion. Like people would come to her to make the same dresses that she was wearing because everything that she was doing was so beautiful, and she would attract all types of people to this company that she worked for, especially men, which a tailor loved because he got a fuck ton of business from all of these men just trying to court her or just trying to like get a look at the beautiful Mary Ellen Pleasant. And this is actually how she met her first husband, James W. Smith, who was a spy for the Underground Railroad. They got married on March 22nd, 1835 in Boston, Massachusetts, according to what I found on Ancestry.com. But even though he fought for all these human rights for other people and people who were enslaved, she said that he was not a good husband. He was, as she described him, a controlling mama's boy who forbade her from wearing all of her beautiful handmade clothes, who didn't like the attention that she was getting from other people, who didn't like the attention that she was getting from men, didn't let her tell her Quaker family about their marriage, and allegedly raped her on their wedding night. Allegedly. For entertainment purposes only, because I don't want people coming after me and suing me for speaking bad about this man. She's quoted to say that she lost her liberties and freedom all over again when she married James W. Smith. She said at one point she did like start to grow to love him, but in 1844, about 9 years after they were married, he died suddenly. And everyone, including her second husband, thought that she might have killed him, but nothing was ever proven. And James W. Smith just left her a rich and free widow. But she promised to spend her money on helping other Black people and became super important to the Underground Railroad. She would dress up as a male jockey and sneak onto plantations to emancipate the slaves there and then take them through like the route on the Underground Railroad. So she was like Harriet Tubman in a way, leading slaves off of plantations, going through the Underground Railroad connections that she made through her Quaker family and that she made through her first husband. And she was leading people out of the South into freedom. She met her second husband, John James Pleasance, which oftentimes he's just called J.J. Pleasance. Sometime during this work, how they met is contested. Some sources say that her mother-in-law of her first husband like introduced them to each other. Others say that he first saw her performing a voodoo ceremony and was immediately intrigued by her. She was once quoted to say that he dressed loudly and wasn't half the man that her first husband was, but they still got together. Now, although he did have the same last name as one of the stories of her parentage, he wasn't related to her at all, even though there were rumors that they were when people were starting to like try to ostracize her in society and trying to like beat down her reputation and stuff. According to the records, Pleasance is even spelled differently, but gossip will be gossip, of course. One source that I read said that one of the main reasons she married him was for his last name, so she could nurse that connection to John Pleasance, her alleged father in one of her origin stories, because J.J. Pleasance's name, even though it was spelled different, could be anglicized too, the same way that her father's name was spelled. But it's all just sort of like speculation and roundabout. What we do know is that they got married. Now, while he wasn't related to her or her father, JJ was the cousin of Louis Christophe Dominique du Galpion. Now, why is he important? And am I going to look for any excuse to say his fancy name again? Well, Louis Christophe Dominique du Galpion was the motherfucking husband of Mary Laveau, as in the Queen of New Orleans. In the late 1840s, it said that Mary and JJ were under fire for all of their work with the Underground Railroad, especially after the Fugitive Slave Law in 1850, which intensified the repercussions for escaped slaves and their fugitives. So after that law passed in 1850, they decided to flee Massachusetts and ended up in New Orleans, where she became best friends, apparently, with her cousin-in-law, Mary Laveau. Because Mary Ellen Pleasant is just the coolest person to ever exist in the world. And I just want to be friends with her. And I want to be friends with Mary Laveau. Like, both of them could just adopt me and I would go back in time and live happily, because this is just like, it's so cool. And I love Marie Laveau. Like, okay, so we're going to go on a tangent. And we're going to let Marie Laveau make a little bit of a cameo in this story. Okay, so the only vacation that I've actually ever been on in my life, aside from like growing up in Florida and going to Disney World for the weekend, which like we wouldn't even get like a hotel. Typically, we would just go because I lived in Central Florida, and Disney World is in Central Florida as well. So the only like actual vacation I've ever been on was for my 1-year wedding anniversary pre-pandemic, where my husband wanted to go and explore spooky shit with me because he's perfect and you should be jealous. And we went to New Orleans. Very first night we went there, I'm sure probably unsurprisingly, we scheduled a history tour. I didn't really want to go on a ghost tour. I wanted to go on a spooky history tour. I think it was called like Witches Brew Tours, something like that. It was really, really good tour. Like, I remember almost everything that man told me, and it's been years. And one of the stops was outside Voodoo Authentica, which is a shop, but it's also a cultural center that's, as they say in New Orleans, is the only one that's run by actual voodoo practitioners. And then the tour guide was like, okay, I'm going to tell you about the Voodoo Queen of New Orleans, and I guarantee you that at least 2 of you are going to want a tattoo of her after this. And I was very intrigued. Now, part of my focus as a historian is the history of witchcraft, but my focus is more like 16th and 17th century witchcraft in like England, Scotland, and the American colonies. So this time period in the 1800s isn't my field of study. I've not done a lot of personal academic research on it. This is a story that we were told. I've done quick little Google searches to see if there are any like mention, and everything that he said had other sources that backed it up. Honestly, though, I haven't done much research on Marie Laveau myself. So if there are any Marie Laveau experts that are listening, feel free to reach out to me, because I like want to know everything about her, and she's fascinating. And I haven't had a chance to do nearly as much research on her because I'm like knee deep in research about the Connecticut witch trials and like English witch trials and stuff like that. So anyway, the tour guide starts telling this story. So Marie was a free woman of color. And I say woman of color and not just Black woman, because she was also Native American and French. So she was a voodoo practitioner, but I mean, obviously, like, honestly, voodoo is not what popular culture paints it to be. It's a lot of like root work. It's a lot of herb work. It's working with like ancestors and stuff like that. It's not working with the devil, like when you watch TV and they're like, oh, voodoo is devil worship. It's not at all. Like, it's a closed practice. So I don't know as much about it because it's not my culture, and I'm not going to like appropriate it or anything, but the research that I have done into it, it's a really, really cool religion. And Marie Laveau actually had a pretty big hand in creating the image of a lot of voodoo as people regarded. But even though she was a free woman, she was still relatively ignored in society, as all Black people and just women of color, even mixed race women, were during this time. Marie Laveau was a hairdresser, and one day there were some white women in her shop, and they were talking about how they saw their slaves performing this voodoo ceremony, and they were very intrigued by it, but they didn't know what to do. And Marie was like, well, girls, don't you know that I'm the motherfucking voodoo queen of New Orleans? And these women were so excited. And this is one of the things that began making her visible in society. But she still used that invisibility that people of color had in New Orleans to her advantage. So Marie would go to the slaves and gather information and gossip on the plantation owners and the elites in New Orleans, and began paying the slaves, and made this whole spy network. So they would be like, hey, Marie, When Mr. Johnson leaves for his business trip to France, Mrs. Johnson has Mr. Taylor come over. And they spend a lot of time in her bedchamber. She would then be invited to be the guest of honor at these like lavish voodoo parties that some of these white women would put on. And Marie would commune with the spirits and put on this big show, and then would be like, Mrs. Johnson, you better stop messing with Mr. Taylor because your husband's going to find out one day and it won't be pretty. And they were all like, oh, how did she know this? So women started paying Marie Laveau to throw these parties, and they, the woman who paid her, would conveniently be left out of these secrets that she would reveal. So Marie started taking bribes essentially to stop people from talking. And then people would come up to her and be like, Marie, my brother Jacques is in jail again, and he's not a bad person. He's just dumb and a drunk. Like, can you please help? And she'd give them all of these things and tell them what to do. And then would like go to the judge in town and invite him to an orgy that she was putting on. And in return, she'd be like, just let Jacques out of jail. He's not a bad guy. He's just a drunk, and we'll keep this little arrangement between us. And your wife doesn't have to know that you're coming to my orgies all the time, but that girl that you like is going to be there. So I know you're also going to be there as well. And then the person who initially went to Marie Laveau for help would praise her for her magical abilities. She also played matchmaker, connecting wealthy men to lower class women who were loyal to Marie and then would like sway their husbands to her favor. So Marie Laveau basically took what the white people regarded as this like exotic practice of voodoo, and she fucking controlled New Orleans in the 19th century. She was one of the most powerful people, let alone women, in Louisiana, when women, especially women of color, were treated like property. So why did she make a cameo? Why have I gone off on this tangent for like the last 5 minutes, probably, other than the fact that Marie Laveau is amazing and I look for any excuse to talk about her that I can? Because it's said by some people who have studied Mary Ellen Pleasant that Marie Laveau taught all of this to Mary Ellen Pleasant, or at least Mary Ellen Pleasant sort of sat back and watched all of this happen. Mary, according to one of her stories, was the daughter of a well-respected voodoo priestess who died before she taught anything to Mary. So story goes, some historians speculate that Marie not only taught her voodoo, but also ways to manipulate society in her favor. So Mary Ellen Pleasant then took this practice with her when her and JJ moved to California 2 years later. So she arrived in San Francisco on April 7th, 1852. On her voyage to California, she met a man named Thomas Bell, who is important to the rest of the story, but this is how her and Thomas Bell meet. So now California was a new state at this time. It only became a state in 1850. They joined the United States as a free state, which sounds wonderful. Like, great, no slavery in California, but it was mostly because the people who lived there didn't want slave owners moving to California to work the gold mines and have an unfair advantage on the wealth there. So, I mean, it's a positive that it was a free state, but like most America, it was rooted in capitalism. So it was also not a safe place to live. It was mostly bars and places to gamble. And one source I read said that 5 murders happened every 6 days. So the simple fact that people chose to go there is beyond me, other than greed. Although California was a free state, that did not mean that it was like an anti-racism state. There were slaves that were brought there, and the judges were, quote, sympathetic to Southern slave owners and just like looked the other way. It did have a fugitive slave law as well that was really steep, and additional Black laws didn't protect Black people at all and made it difficult for any Black person to be successful. Part of the law also said that if you didn't have freedom papers and you were Black, or even just like a little bit Black, they would just send you away back into slavery, even if you weren't born a slave and therefore didn't have papers that said that you were free. So even though Mary was a free woman, there wasn't really a way for her to prove it. Like, she didn't have freedom papers because she'd been freed for decades at this point. So what was she to do? Well, remember when I said everyone would comment about how fair her skin was when she was younger? When she got to California, she told everyone she was actually a white woman, using the name she adopted and then her first husband's last name, because that was a relatively white name. She became Mrs. Ellen Smith. She got a job working around the wealthiest men in California spied on them and gathered their secrets. And then she used these secrets along with the inheritance from her first husband to invest in different companies and opened up multiple businesses like boarding houses and restaurants and saloons and libraries and a railroad, and started just accumulating more and more wealth. She started referring to herself as Mary Pleasant Capitalist. So Thomas Bell, who I mentioned very briefly, he was a white man who worked at a bank, and he said to have helped her acquire some of her investments because it was easier for a man to make these kind of financial gains than a woman. Like, even though she was saying that she was a white woman and passing for a white woman in society, like, women were still looked down upon. They got really close. I don't think that they had a romantic relationship. There's nothing that like shows that they had a romantic relationship, but their relationship is definitely unique. In California, there was like an unequal divide between men and women. I read one source that said that men outnumbered women 6-1, and a lot of the social function involved women from brothels. So Mary Ellen Pleasant started matchmaking. She'd find sex workers that she thought had promise, and she would educate them and then match them with the wealthiest men in society. She wasn't actually a madam running brothels, but she was an owner of a few of them for a little bit, but decided that they weren't a very good investment, and then ended up converting those brothels into boarding houses. She continued to work for the abolitionist movement and worked the Underground Railroad in California, sneaking slaves in and employing them at her companies and helping them establish their own businesses. She rescued ex-slaves by giving them writs of freedom that would prevent them from being extradited back to the slave states. Oftentimes, these writs of freedom were forged just to make it look like they were actually freed. She encouraged her wealthy friends to donate to her favorite causes. And I do want to mention, although she was passing for white in society, these former slaves that she helped, like, knew that she was Black. They knew what her real name was. And they knew that they could always come to her in California if they needed anything. If something happened or if they needed help, she would do all that she could. And they started calling her Black City Hall. She made even more of a name for herself as an abolitionist when she helped John Brown, who was a very extreme abolitionist. He's best known for attempting to capture the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry in Virginia with 21 slaves that he had freed from the area. She said that she gave him between $30,000 and $40,000, which with current inflation is over $1 million today. And she helped purchase a slave refuge, which was part of his plan. When he was hanged in 1859, there was a note that was found in his pocket that read, quote, "The axe is laid at the foot of the tree. When the first blow is struck, there will be more money to help." And she signed it MEP, but the way that she wrote it, it looked like WEP. So as officials tried to look for this mysterious benefactor, they went in all of these different directions, but never in hers. She was, after all, just a woman. She was, after all, just a white woman, and her initials were MEP, not WEP. In 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation passed, and on that year's census in 1863, Mary stopped pretending that she was white and declared proudly that she was a Black woman. And that's pretty much when everything started going downhill for her, because people are awful, and they always have been. In 1863, Black people could start testifying in court in California, and she was not afraid to do that. One of the major things that she did was go up against the streetcar companies for throwing Black people off of streetcars or just refusing service to them altogether. And she won. So she was essentially Rosa Parks 100 years before Rosa Parks. Before there were even buses, she was battling the streetcar companies. One of the cases went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And although she lost the monetary part of the settlement, her case was used over 100 years later in the 1980s in a civil rights case and helped change California laws when it came to punitive damages, which is like pain and suffering associated with discrimination. And I cannot understand why more people don't know about her. Pleasant continued working with her partner, Thomas Bell, during their relationship. They accrued $30 million, which in today's dollars is almost 1 billion with a B, billion US dollars. And Mary used a lot of this to help her community. But they also lived together in a mansion that had over 30 rooms that they built in 1870. Now, with their relationship, there were stories that go back and forth about the nature of their relationship. Like I said, I don't think that there was a romantic relationship between them, but like there could have been a romantic relationship with them. But he lived in the house, their 30 plus mansion. They lived together with his wife and children, and like maybe her husband JJ. I couldn't really find any more about him other than that he died in 1880. So I'm assuming that he also lived there with her, or I don't know, but because she was not only a Black woman but an incredibly successful Black woman, of course, people started talking shit about her, and people started trying to bring her down in society, and people started trying to slander her name. They started using her association with brothels, began calling her a madam, and then they started demeaning her even more and began calling her Mammy Pleasant, which is a terribly derogatory term for anyone who isn't familiar with it. The Jim Crow Museum at Ferris State University says that Mammy is the most well-known and enduring racial caricature of African American women. She was economic, political, and social. She typically was an overweight, always smiling and happy Black woman. They were typically depicted as child caretakers or cooks, and they were slaves that worked in the house and tried to be part of the family and were happy with their position as a slave with a lot of love for their white family, but was never actually treated as part of the family. And typically this character was disgusted with her own family and looked at other people who were enslaved with disdain. So pretty much like if you've seen Django Unchained, like Samuel L. Jackson's character, but a woman, you know how he's like, you know, talking shit about the other slaves and all of that. So like basically like that, but like very, very happy to just be close to the white family and be blessed to be in the home with the white family. The image of the Mammy was most likely created as a response to the abolitionist movement, with pro-slavery people being like, see, it's not that bad. Not everyone treats their slaves terribly. There's sometimes one slave on a plantation of hundreds who are happy. You know, even though everyone else is not, there's one slave who might be a little bit happy with the situation. So slavery is not that bad. But the Jim Crow Museum says that she was just a product of propaganda. And looking into the primary sources, a woman like this working in the home, they don't appear. There aren't records from any plantations that show this kind of relationship with anyone who would look like this stereotype. In some of the very, very wealthy households where they had slaves to spare, they would sometimes have one or very few women who were enslaved who were in the home. And they were typically, like I talked about, very light-skinned, mixed race, very skinny, very young, and typically were used for sexual reasonings, like Sally Hemings with Jefferson at Monticello. Slavery at times was like literally sex trafficking, like we've talked about. It's disgusting. And Mary Ellen Pleasant being called a mammy was really insulting and really demeaning. It was like they were saying that because she was trying to assimilate into, quote, white spaces, that she was perfectly happy with them and how they treated people of color. But as much as she loved, quote, white culture and the, quote, white families that she was a part of, she would always be beneath them. And Mary tried to say that this didn't bother her. She just tried to be like water off a duck's back. But they were demeaning her so much. At one point, she said, quote, "They paid the newspapers to malign and vilify me and to blacken my character, but I did not reply to their assaults because I had staunch supports in the city. And so long as they supported me, I did not care one snap of a little finger." But it did bother her. Like, you can't go through life being called a whore and a demeaning racist term. And she did speak out about the use of this name, saying that she wasn't a mammy. She was not a mammy to all of California. There's one account where like a pastor in Sacramento wrote her a letter and addressed her as Mammy Pleasant. And she wrote back to him that her name was Mrs. Mary Ellen Pleasant, and he would address her as such. And she would not respond to a letter that was addressed to her with any other name other than Mrs. Mary Ellen Pleasant. And that she wrote this to him on his own paper because he was not worthy of her to waste anything in response. And then everything just got even worse for her. People started whispering that she was a voodoo queen. And that's how she got her wealth. And that's how she got her control of the city, because a woman couldn't possibly be powerful and successful on her own without otherworldly and supernatural help, especially if she was a woman of color. In 1883, she was involved in a court case against a senator. His name was Senator William Sharon of Nevada. He was accused of seducing and abandoning a woman named Sarah Althea Hill. Allegedly, he wrote letters to Sarah stating that she was his common-law wife and that he would always support her and yada, 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 what sometimes men say to women to get what they want. Not all men, I know, but like a lot of men. And then he just up and abandoned her. And he kicked her out of the room that she was living in his hotel. So Mary, who was friends with Sarah Althea Hill, backed her financially when she decided she wanted to sue William Sharon. And this case was insane. People were obsessed with it. It was like, you know how like the O.J. Simpson case was just like in the media, or like the Casey Anthony trial, like everyone was talking about it. Everyone knew about it. Everyone was writing about it. And although Mary Ellen Pleasant wasn't on trial, she was a big part of it. And so William Sharon's lawyers started attacking her, even though she wasn't even on trial, using the voodoo argument against her, saying she used her voodoo powers to influence the senator on Sarah's behalf, and he never would have done the things that he did or said the things that he said if it wasn't for Mary and her sorcery. And that's bullshit. Obviously, especially considering that William Sharon admitted that what he did to Sarah was wrong and that he did it of his own volition. But Mary just like embraced the rumors and started bringing a voodoo doll to court and saying that she would bring about the death of William Sharon if he didn't right his wrongs. And then he died before the trial even ended. So it kind of backfired a little bit, but yeah, it kind of backfired a little bit. There's no really but about it. There was no positive. And even though he died, he posthumously won the case. So people just started really like playing at the whole voodoo thing, and we're just like blowing her up in the press. In 1892, her business partner, Thomas Bell, died. He actually toppled over the banisters from the top floor of their mansion and like plunged to his death, which is fucking terrifying, which of course Mary Ellen Pleasant was blamed for, but they performed an autopsy and there was like no nefarious activity involved that they could find, and she wasn't charged with anything, but the media still was sensationalizing that the voodoo queen has made a sacrifice. The voodoo queen has murdered her friend or whatever. So 7 years later, when his wife Teresa, who in multiple sources that I read said Mary introduced to Thomas, was apparently influenced by her new lover, Bayard Seville, and she kicked Mary out of her own fucking house. So Mary and Thomas shared their wealth, but they trusted each other a lot. And a lot of things were in his name for legal reasons. Just because at the time, it was better for a white man to have these things rather than a black woman. And because they trusted each other so much, like there was no problem that they saw. So according to the courts, the mansion belonged to Thomas, and therefore, now that he's dead, belonged to Thomas's widow, and therefore she could do whatever she wanted. In fact, Teresa perpetuated the whole mammy thing and said that Mary's role in the house was just to take care of the children and to cook food and to clean, and not that she majorly contributed to the massive wealth that they accrued. And that was her home that she owned with her friend Thomas Bell and allowed Teresa and her children to live there. It did not matter. According to the courts, everything belonged to Teresa, and according to the courts, Mary Ellen Pleasant deserved nothing. And then Teresa started a smear campaign against Mary, saying that she was a terrible voodoo priestess who kept Thomas as a prisoner and influenced everyone, and everything that she did was only to benefit herself, and she was this terrible person. She called her, quote, a demon from first to last. Teresa's lover, Bayard Seville, by the way, was a man who was known to seduce rich widows and extort them for as much money as he could and then abandon them. So he went to prison multiple times for forgery and stole a ton of Teresa's money and committed forgeries in her name. So like great choices, but also karma. And then what happened to Mary? Mary died later in poverty on January 4th, 1904. She lost everything and didn't even have a home. She ended up living with her friends. And when she died, the San Francisco Examiner wrote, quote, "Mammy Pleasant will work her weird spells no more." Teresa was later regarded as insane. She was addicted to opium and alcohol. She disowned her children, saying that they were not hers at all. And she died in 1922 alone and abandoned by everyone, being called the, quote, "Mad Woman of Glen Ellen." In 1925, a fire burned down almost all of Mary's mansion, and then it was demolished later on that year. The only thing remaining were the 6 eucalyptus trees that she planted outside. So that's the story of Mary Ellen Pleasant. She was an amazing woman. So how is she remembered and how is she memorialized? Mary Ellen Pleasant, mother of civil rights in California. Harriet Tubman of California. Rosa Parks, 100 years before Rosa Parks, the first Black female millionaire. Well, a few years after Teresa died, a murder mystery came out called The Cat and the Canary that featured a mysterious servant named Mary Pleasant, who you were never quite sure if she would murder someone or cast a curse or do some other wicked deed. This play later became a movie that was adapted multiple times. The first 2 adaptations, the character is called Mary Pleasant, and then in the 1978 recreation, it was changed to Mrs. Pleasant. But in every version, the character is played by a white woman. In 1950, some biographies were written about her by Helen Holdridge based on the awful rumors and based off of Teresa's diaries. You know, the crazy lady that was addicted to opium and an alcoholic that ran a smear campaign against Mary. In her diaries, Teresa spoke about her terribly and called her a demon and accused her of doing things like pushing Thomas over the banister and pulling his brains out of his head, which is an insane work of magic because his skull wasn't broken, and they did an autopsy to determine the cause of his death, and it wasn't found to be nefarious at all. But of course, these biographies paint Teresa as the victim and ignored all of her pesky delusions and make Mary Ellen Pleasant into a fucking monster. In the 1960s, one of the final wishes that she had was finally granted to her, like 60 years after her death. And they added to her gravestone, "Friend of John Brown," because it was never discovered that she was this mystery WEP, MEP that signed the note when he was hanged. And her grave is now a designated freedom site in the National Park Services. And she has a street named after her on Nob Hill. And the 6 trees that are all that remains of her mansion have become the smallest park in San Francisco. And there's like a little plaque there that calls her the mother of civil rights. It makes a very small statement about her work with the Underground Railroad. But most people who go to San Francisco and hear about Mary Ellen Pleasant most likely hear her story on a ghost tour, where they go to the smallest park of 6 eucalyptus trees at Bush and Octavia, and they tell the story of the evil Mary Ellen Pleasant, the voodoo queen who haunts the... Sorry, I'm getting really emotional about this. I'm sorry. The voodoo queen who haunts the trees, summoning chills and frightening dogs and small children, who throws nuts at people as they pass by. And the tour guides talk about how Mary Ellen Pleasant came to San Francisco in the mid-1800s and defied prejudice and built an empire, and how she was a voodoo queen and a murderer, and now she's no better than a demon, and a scary story meant to give you chills and put you on edge. And that is her legacy for the hundreds, if not thousands, of tourists who go on these tours every single year. They walk away having nightmares of the evil Mary Ellen Pleasant, hoping that they don't get cursed by the vindictive ghost of the voodoo queen, and that fucking enrages me. But like, we still have statues of Confederate soldiers and people fighting to keep them up and defending states' rights and defending the history of the South, when everything that they stood for is hatred and capitalism. And we have presidents' faces carved into a monument on a mountainside of a sacred mountain. 2 of those presidents of which owned slaves, and Mary Ellen Pleasant has a street and 6 trees and a plaque and a fucking ghost story. And that is how she was remembered. And that, my friends, is what is truly fucked up about this story, and why when I researched her, she went to the very top of my list to talk about. She was a wonderful, beautiful woman who fought for people who were being oppressed and built an empire in the mid 1800s at over $30 million. But if you Google the first Black female millionaire in America, it is CJ Walker, who was amazing, but not accurate. And if you Google a picture of her, you'll see all of these beautiful images of her as a young woman and one single one as an old woman. And all of the pictures of the younger women are Queen Emma of Hawaii. And the most extensive book about her that I could find is amazing and unearthed so much information on her that we didn't have before. But the author, Susheel Bibbs, has spent the better part of her life researching her and stripped away so much of like the negative propaganda that surrounded Mary and her name, but basically says that Mary Ellen Pleasant made the choices that she did and fought for the things that she fought for and did everything that she did based on what Marie Laveau taught her in like the year and a half that they were together, and employed what Bibbs calls the Laveau method. And this is not to like shit talk Marie Laveau, because I love her, obviously. And like, I'm one of those two people that the tour guide talked about that would get a tattoo of her in a second. And I'm not shit talking Susheel Bibbs either. And I think what she wrote is amazing. And if that's what she thinks, then that is her argument. That is fine. Like historians and people who look into people, they make arguments all the time, but I respectfully disagree. Because while, yeah, it can be said that Mary Ellen Pleasant did do a lot of the same things that Marie Laveau did, as far as like matchmaking and using her invisibility to gather secrets to push herself into a career, it almost negates the kind of person Mary was. Mary was doing so much more before she met Marie, and did so much more after she left Marie, and to equate it all to a Laveau model from someone that she knew for a year and a half, it just does not sit right with me. Because Mary Ellen Pleasant is probably one of my favorite historical figures ever. She said once, quote, "My cause was the cause of freedom and equality for myself and for my people, and I would rather be a corpse than a coward." So I choose to make an active attempt to live a little bit more like Mary Ellen Pleasant. And I think that everyone should make an attempt to live a little bit more like Mary Ellen Pleasant, because the world would be so much of a better place. And don't forget her. And don't fucking demonize her, because she was amazing. And I think of like all of the people who are alive today that most likely have Mary Ellen Pleasant to thank for the fact that they are alive today. And she's a fucking demon that lives in the trees and throws nuts at people. So that is all for today. Thank you so much for listening. If you have a story from history or mythology that you would like to hear me discuss, please reach out, because I'm always looking for like new ideas and stuff. And if you like what you heard today and like to hear more, please consider subscribing or leaving a review, or I do have a Patreon that you can join. And remember, friends, history may be watching you, so don't fuck it up, because society has fucked up so much in the past, and we can just like try and be a little bit better than the generations that came before us. So bye.